Book 4, Chapter 1. Humboldt at Home. From the time of his return from Central Asia till the day of his death, Humboldt resided in Berlin. His house was in Orenburger Strasse, at a little district from the Spree. It was a quiet neighborhood, in the northern part of the city, not far from the place of the king. The palace was his home too, wherever he chose to make it so. Indeed, during a large portion of the year, he might have been said to reside with the king. When he gave up Paris for Berlin, he entered into closer relationships with the sovereign than was enjoyed by any other person in the kingdom outside the royal family. The tie that bound them was one of the noblest that had ever bound a monarch and a subject. The king honored Humboldt for his profound wisdom, and Humboldt respected the king for his many excellent qualities. It was a sincere, disinterested friendship on both sides. The gain, however, was with the king, rather than with Humboldt, for the rank and emulation that he bestowed upon Humboldt, more repaid by his society and conversation. Besides his palace at Berlin, the king had palaces at Potsdam and Charlottenburg. The Charlottenburg palace was 2 or 3 miles from Berlin, outside the Brandenburg gates. It was built by the king on his marriage with the Princess Sophia Charlotte. The gardens in which it stood were prettily laid out, diversified with the windings of the Spree, and several small lakes filled with carp. These carp were trained to come out at the sound of a bell and pop their noses out of the water for crumbs. At Potsdam there were 4 royal palaces, the noted of which were the celebrated Sans Souci, built by Frederick the Great in 1745-47. It stood on the terrace of the right of a broad avenue, which ran through the grounds. The grounds and gardens were laid out in stiff, formal French style of the last century. Here, embowered by alleys and cut hedges, were statues of fauns and wood nymphs, and their fountains spouting foam in the marble basins. Vines, olives, and oranges grew in hot houses, and at the end of the terrace on which the palace was built were the graves of the great Frederick's favorite dogs, and one of his horses that had borne him through many battles. Old Fritz loved the spot, and just before his death he used it to be brought to him in a great armchair, to bask in the sun with his dogs around him. In the gardens of Sans Souci stood the Charlottenburg Palace, built by Frederick William IV. When he was crown prince, it was in the style of a Pomeranian dwelling, elegant and tasteful, with the beautiful fountains and antique altar, and a number of statues and bronzes from Pompeii and Herculaneum. This was the king's favorite residence while at Potsdam, and where Humboldt generally resided when he visited him, several rooms being set apart for his exclusive use. The commencement of 1830 found Humboldt and his companions, Rose and Ehrenberg, at work on their Asiatic journey, but some years elapsed before it was ready for publication. Humboldt's portion was ready first, which could hardly have been expected. A considerable portion of his time was being taken up with his official duties. He sought the advice and assistance of his scientific friends, as was his custom when he was undertaking his great works. This obliged him to reside a while in Paris. He was also sent thither to the king with a diplomatic mission to acknowledge Louis Philip the new regime. This was in September 1830. In February 1831 he filed another mission there, while his brother William, who had retired from politics shortly before the death of his wife, was decorated with the Order of the Black Eagle at home, and admitted into the Council of State. It was at this time that Humboldt met Agassiz, then a poor student, now the celebrated professor. I was only 24 years of age, says Eggs in his touching tribute to the memory of Humboldt. I was only 24 years of age when in Paris, whither I had gone with means given to me by a friend, but was as about to resign my studies from want of ability to express my expenses. Professor Mitscherlich was then on a visit to Paris, and I had seen him in the morning, when he had asked me what was the cause of my depressed feelings, and I told him that I had to go, for I had nothing left. The next morning, as I was seated at the breakfast in front of the yard of the hotel where I lived, I saw the servant of Humboldt approach. He handed me a note saying there was no answer and disappeared. I opened the note, and I see it now before me, as distinctly as I held the paper in my hand. It said, "My friend, I hear that you intend leaving Paris in consequence of some embarrassments. That shall not be. I wish you to remain here as long as the object for which you came is not accomplished. I enclose you a check for £50. It is a loan which you may repay when you can." Some years afterwards, when I could have repaid him, I wrote asking for the privilege of remaining forever in his debt, knowing that his request would be for more consonant to his feelings than the recovery of the money. And I am now in his debt. For what has he done for me? I know he has done for many others, in silence and unknown to the world. It is a circumstance worth noticing, continues Professor Agnes, that above all great powers, Prussia has more distinguished scientific and literary men among her diplomats than any other state, and so Humboldt was actually a diplomatist in Paris, though he was placed in that position not from choice but in consequence of the benevolence of the king, who wanted to give him an opportunity of being in Paris as often as long as he chose. But from that time there was two men in him, the diplomatist living in the Hotel des Princes, and the naturalist who roamed in the Rue de la Harpe, in a modest apartment in the second story, where his scientific friends had access to him every day before 7. After that, he was frequently seen working in the library of the Institute until the time when the Grand Signor made his appearance at the court, or in the salons of Paris. It was through Humboldt's liberally in 1833 that Agis was enabled to commence the publication of his great work on fossil fishes, and the fulfillment of a mission suggested to the King of Prussia at the same kind friend that he emigrated to the United States in 1846. Besides filling the diplomatic missions which called him to Paris, Humboldt was busily engaged in seeing through the press the first installment of his journey to Central Asia. It was published in 1831 under the title of Asiatic Fragments. It was not a narrative of journey, but for the writing of the narrative was assigned to Rost, but a dissertation in 2 octavo novels on the geology and climatology. The first volume treats of the mountain ridges and the volcanoes of Central Asia, and of the various kinds of eruptions in different parts of the region, comparing them with similar eruptions in America. He has everywhere interspersed, says Professor Kleck, numerous geognostic observations and notes on the general formation of the soils between the Atal and the Himalaya mountains, and his communications on the remarkable occurrence of volcanoes in the middle of the continent and far from the ocean are of great interest. Here Humboldt placed science on a new footing, for he had the special opportunity of observing the volcanoes in 3 different quarters of the world. He perceived that the volcanic phenomena can no longer be considered as belonging to the geological developments, but as that they must be explained by physical history in general. as the volcanic activity seemed to him to be in the result of continual communication between the interior of the Earth, which is in a molten fluid condition, and the atmosphere which surrounds the hardened and oxidized crust of our planet. On this theory, he explained the still active and extinct craters, the distinction of the mountain ridges, and the formation of the soil. He deciphered the traces of former terrestrial revolutions, their relative age and physical powers, which have influenced and still influence the great force of the Earth. Thus, the masses of lava which pour from the craters were to him the petrified streams of formerly gushing springs of the interior of the Earth. From the connection and similarity of the effects, he traced the causes and conditions of the formation of rocks and the superincumbent strata of the chemical results of the volcanic eruptions, of elevations and depressions of the Earth's surface. By the strictest investigation of all occurring new appearances, and by penetrating combination of analogous observed facts, he explained numerous physical and geological problems, whose exact solution had hitherto been deemed impossible. Humboldt thinks that the volcanic activity of our Earth compared to former ages is considerably decreased. It can no longer bring forth new elevations or heat in the north, but can only produce small craters and an agitation of the Earth's surface. Before the advent of man into terrestrial nature, a tropical animal and vegetable world flourished everywhere on the volcanically heated Earth. Now, on the cooled planet, the petrified surface only receives the warmth of the sun. The tropical luxuriance cried out towards the north, and only flourishes where the sun can exercise its perpendicular influence on the tropics. In the remote ages of the boiling center of our Earth, all the hot fluid and the gases it generated often, and on many points burst through the firm crust of its tremendous force, made clefts and depressions in it, which were the molten masses of metal, basalt, and other matter flowed, which were now petrified, and now lie in thus formed mountain ridges. Thus arose the Cordilleras, the Andes, the Himalayan mountains, and thus was petrified the waving surface of the broken soil into those hills and valleys, which transform our plains into picturesque landscapes. From these causes, Humboldt explained the peculiarities of the Asiatic soil. It was in consequence of the volcanic power which raised mountains and continents and swelled up the earth crust, bubbling like a gigantic vault, that these two hollow vaults sank down in the course of ages, and thus Humboldt established that the depression of the earth of the surface of the old world, where the level of the Caspian Sea, like that of the Sea of Ural, lies 200 or 300 feet below the level of the ocean, and where the depression of the firm soil extends as far as Orenburg and Saratow, in the southeast, probably as far as the so-called Central Plain, is nothing but a crater land like that of the moon, where the large points above 100 miles broad, called Hipparch, Archimedes, and Ptolemy, form a basin of formation such as exists also near home, for instance in Bohemia. Before Humboldt's journey into the interior of Asia, there existed many erroneous notions of the geography, the connection of the mountain chains, and the productions of the soil of these districts. But as an entirely new view of the country which was acquired through the bold and penetrating traveler, who made a large number of independent latitude measurements, and who obtained varied information on traveling routes and local circumstances from traveled Tatars, Bulgarians, and Czechs, as well as from Russian officers. The interior central parts of Asia was not, as had been supposed, an immense agglomeration of mountains, nor an uninterrupted tableland, for Humboldt established that this part of the world was crossed from east to west by forked mountain systems. By the Altai, which ends westward in Persons district, by the Himmelsberg, by Kunan, and by the Himalaya, which had exercised authenticated influence on the historical migrations of nations. And thus Humboldt discovered a volcanic territory in the center of Asia, which is 1,000 to 1,400 miles distinct from the oceans, and which presents a surface of 2,500 geographical miles.